This episode is funded by the British Podcast Award Fund and the Wellcome Trust. Today we speak with Dr. Justin Havens. Justin spent a brief spell in the military before a career within industry. In 2008, he retrained as a therapist who specialised in trauma and researched his PhD in traumatic nightmares. My name is Michael Coates. I'm a former firefighter and soldier. I run a veteran-owned business and I'm an ambassador for Lululemon. And it's in these episodes we bring together all of these communities to support society during the COVID-19 pandemic. We speak to experts, friends and community leaders to talk about best practice, mental fitness, growth and the facts. This is brought to you by the Declassified Network, and this is Declassified COVID-19. Justin, what is a nightmare?
Well, in simple terms, Michael, a nightmare is just a distressing dream that wakes you up. But of course, there's a vast difference between kind of waking up in the morning thinking, oh, that was a bit nasty, through to being so fearful of going to sleep that you've got to drink a bottle of scotch and waking up at 1 o'clock in the morning knowing you're never going to get back to sleep. So, and those are the nightmares that I'm really interested in, because those are the ones that can be so debilitating on people's lives.
And why would it, or how does it happen? Why do we have them?
Well, the first thing is that although some people think they don't actually dream, we all dream for about 2 hours a night. And whilst we're dreaming, which is during what's called rapid eye movement sleep, that's our brain's natural way of processing the emotionally upsetting events of the day, if you like. And it's really part of our natural healing processes that we needed to evolve as human beings. If we didn't have that process, the caveman, when he went to fight his first saber-toothed tiger, he wouldn't have come out the next day again. So dreaming is a natural process to deal with traumatic events. And a nightmare is essentially when that process has been interrupted, it's stuck, it's run out of ideas, or it's too emotionally intense. And those nightmares can then become easily perpetuate as a chronic condition that can last for 60, 70, 80 years. There'll still be, veterans from World War II or even the Korean War who are still experiencing nightmares as a result of that.
When you spoke then, does it file away good memories as well and good emotions, or is it just focus on things that have kind of changed your worldview, this traumatic stuff?
Well, the whole sleep process, there's an interesting saying that we sleep to remember and we sleep to forget. So we want to remember, when we're learning things, that's the brain's way of filing away information that's useful. And then the dreaming to forget, sleeping to forget is, as I say, is to drain the emotional intensity out of disturbing and traumatic memories. And that's really what's going on when we're dreaming. The interesting thing is it all happens in its own little kind of black box, if you like, or a washing machine, as I use in some of my resources, where, the washing machine of the mind is cleaning up the dirty washing, which is the distressing events and things that have experienced us, so that we start again afresh. That's really, it's a really natural process. And so that's really what I'm interested in doing. When we cut our arm and we create the conditions for healing, we clean the wound, we stitch it, dress it. A week later, when we take the dressing off and go, wow, it's healed, we just take that as read. It's normal. And the brain has similar processes for cleaning up trauma. And that's what I'm really passionate about.
And then why wouldn't it get cleaned up?
Well, it wouldn't get cleaned up if it couldn't complete the task, if the dream got interrupted. And that's really how the dream being interrupted is the equivalent of the washing machine kind of getting stuck, the door being opened and all the dirty water and washing being strewn out over the floor. That's the person waking up at 3 a.m. in floods of sweat, terrified after they've had a very visceral re-experiencing of potentially past traumas. Not all nightmares are past traumas as well. It's worthwhile saying there are two types of nightmares: the post-traumatic ones, but then also idiopathic nightmares, which might be reflecting a kind of a core anxiety that you might have. And so people can still be disturbed with idiopathic nightmares. It's just based on completely fictional content, but which are nonetheless still very distressing.
So when we have a nightmare, and just trying to differentiate between the two, when we have a nightmare, and we're fully, we're naked at a job interview,
Yeah.
and you wake up and you're in hot sweats, is that still a nightmare?
Yeah, that's still a nightmare. I mean, a good example to differentiate is if you're in a ski resort and let's say the day before someone was killed in an avalanche, and then you have a dream about being caught in an avalanche, and then it turns into a nightmare as you get woken up as you feel you're drowning and suffocating. That's an idiopathic nightmare. But if you had a close escape and nearly got caught in an avalanche, that's a post-traumatic nightmare. But I'm not interested in differentiating. I'm just interested in helping people resolve their nightmares so they can return to peaceful sleep. And and there are a lot of benefits from that. That sleep, even that for those with young children, we know that if you start losing your sleep, it affects your mental health. You become more irritable, you lose energy, you lose focus. And then when you throw that in with the symptoms of PTSD and trauma, then it's doubly worse. So, we're just interested in what's in helping people return to normal sleep, resetting the sleep cycle, as I sometimes call it.
How did you start with all this? How have you got to this point where we're speaking today?
Well, I retrained in 2008 as a therapist and quickly got into trauma because I got a bit of ex-military background. It was an area I was interested in, so I trained in a form of therapy called EMDR, which is really effective for treating PTSD and trauma. And I came across some work from an American military psychologist and thought, this is really good, but it hasn't been researched, it hasn't been evaluated. And that's really kicked off the research at the Veterans and Families Institute at the Anglia Ruskin University. And that really took me through from 2014 to 2019 and culminated in a multi-site trial across all of the recovery centres. So I did this, veterans were my target audience, but this approach applies to everyone. And I'm sure we're going to get on to the impact of COVID and also sexual trauma, which are extremely prevalent, and road traffic accidents and all the general trauma. But as part of my research, we evaluated this technique, teaching it in a 2-hour block to veterans, and measuring the impact on their sleep and nightmares, and interestingly, their PTSD symptoms. And what we found is those that were able to use this approach that I'm going to describe in more detail in a little bit, their PTSD symptoms reduced by about an average of 50%. So not everybody would have a significant impact, but on average it was 50%, which wasn't bad for a 2-hour session, group session. So that was one of the really, that was a really important outcome. We published the research in a US journal of military behavioral health. And I've gone on since then to really try and get these tools in a more digestible fashion, which is why I've created an easy to look at animation. And I can talk about that in a bit more detail as we go on with this podcast.
Before we get there, why did you start researching it? Break that down a little bit further. So before we get to this technique, what was that kind of spark where you went through, you'd obviously trained it with the EMDR and the other trauma therapies. Why was you seeing this again and again? Was you seeing that sleep was such a big issue, or lack of sleep, and especially nightmares?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, nightmares are a core and a perpetuating symptom of PTSD. In fact, I almost tell people they are the PTSD. They represent the unprocessed traumatic memory that's sitting in someone that's causing all of the problems. And that, combined with the fact that there were no really effective treatments being used, and in many cases, no early interventions being used, and just the idea that, hang on, we've got a massive problem here, and actually we've now got a potential solution which can help people in a very short amount of time. The outcome from my research in 2016 was not dissimilar in terms of impact on trauma symptoms from the combat stress 6-week intensive treatment program. So, I knew that there was something really important with dealing with a problem that was really unrecognized, underreported. Many people who've had therapy still have problems with nightmares afterwards. 40% of the people in my study, for example, had already had trauma-focused therapy. It's also nightmares, as we were discussing earlier, is a can be a key component of suicide. And we know veteran suicide is a key issue. Suicide is a key issue anyway. And so when sleep has been destroyed, it has such a debilitating effect that if you can very early on in therapy, or even offering it as a self-help tool, help people return to peaceful sleep and clear up some of their trauma, it's a real no-brainer as far as I was concerned. And that's why I've been really passionate about this for a few years now, I guess.
When we look at suicide, and not just the what's the word? The sadness of losing someone through suicide, and especially with a community. And I see it only recently. Someone else took their own life. But the kind of fantasy of it, the planning of it, and those that don't go through it for thankfully reasons. So you're saying that there is a direct link between, in your study, between those that are contemplating it, planning it, and attempting it, and the lack of sleep and these intrusive nightmares?
Well, not necessarily through my study. I wasn't studying that particular link, but there have been published studies which I kind of found as part of the PhD research, which certainly show that there is a link between the two. And we know that the desperate levels that people get to, where the trauma just won't go away, and if people are having nightly issues with nightmares, it's in their face the whole time. And again, this would be my hypothesis, that people are trying to escape the trauma, and the final escape obviously is taking your own life, which is a tragic event. So I don't want to play too much on this, but other than the fact that it's an important factor that needs to be considered, and really it's all about the relief of symptoms, and trying to do that in the safest, quickest, most efficient way. And in these times of limited resources and everything else, when you come up with something and when you've got some evidence behind it, you really want to get that out to as many people as possible. Which is why I've created some of the YouTube videos that we'll go on and talk about a little bit.
We'll get on to that in just 2 seconds. One thing I want to talk about just before we go there is the link between self-medication, whether that's sex, drinking, drugs, but specifically drinking, because I know a lot of friends and acquaintances have gone down that avenue to get to sleep, as well as physical activity. Before or during your studies, are you seeing that as a link as well? People using self-medication to get to sleep?
Yeah, absolutely. We all self-medicate to a degree, but when you've got what's someone described as a juggernaut coming down the road at you every night, you want to blot the whole thing out. So, exercise or extreme exercise or alcohol are kind of the common things. And when we can deal with the perception of the terror of the nightmare, and to change that, to actually almost turn it on its head so that there's nothing to fear. You've got nothing to fear from your dream because you're in control and can do something about it, which we'll get onto. Then the need for drinking becomes less. And I've seen people, it's no good saying you can't have trauma therapy until you're clean or whatever. But if people are drinking because of the trauma, so you've got to deal with the root cause of the problem. And that's why I like this approach so much, because we're really trying to deal with the root cause of the problem, which is the unprocessed trauma presenting itself as a nightmare, which is then having such an impact.
So the dream completion technique, this is what you've developed.
Yeah.
What is it? Okay,
so the first, and this, as I said, we've got this animation which describes this whole process. The first part is educating people. Dreaming is normal, and dreaming in response to trauma is normal, and a nightmare is just a stuck dream where that process hasn't completed. And what we're trying to do is almost prime the dream to complete. And the way we do that is we only focus on the point in the dream where the person is woken up in the most recent dream. And at that point, we're saying, what do you want to happen next that would feel good and is totally unconstrained? So to go back to that avalanche example, now what probably wouldn't work is just imagining yourself skiing out of the avalanche in kind of fear. What might work, though, is imagining yourself pulling ahead in a running race to rapturous applause. So we're inserting a new idea, a new dream idea into the dream. And what's interesting, this is the key part, is if it's positively charged, if it feels good at a gut level, it gets sucked into the dream. And you may not even be aware of it, other than waking up in the morning thinking, I didn't get disturbed last night. And the reason that works, some people go, well, how can that work? How can I think about something now and that appear in my dream? And what I normally say to those people is, well, if I plonked you in front of a TV and you watched a horror film, you wouldn't be surprised if you dreamt about it. And so ideas get carried into dreams on the back of emotion. And that's really the principle behind it. So another quick example might be, and this is a military-related one from someone that was in the Falklands War. They were a machine gunner on a ship, and the Skyhawk planes were attacking them, and he was having a replay of that nightmare. And that's all it was. It was a replay of the nightmare. Sometimes in the nightmare, it would be what didn't happen in real life, which is that the bombs exploded and they all died. And it was pretty horrific, and it went on for many, many years. The idea that he put into his dream was he was simply just imagined himself grabbing the aeroplane out of the sky and throwing it away like a boomerang. Now, in your dreams, anything is possible. This is a key part of what I'm trying to teach, that you can do whatever you want. It can be violent, it can be funny, it can be crazy, it can defy the laws of morality, physics. And he just went to sleep thinking, this is what I want to happen in my dream. And if it works completely, then job done. It can solve after one night. Sometimes it takes a little bit more effort. Sometimes it requires the help of a therapist to help you with this. But it can work really well. And not just for military trauma, but many of the people I see in my private practice have experienced childhood sexual abuse, which is, leaves real blots on people's lives. And when people have been having, nightmares several times a week, for 20, 30, 40 years, as a result of what happened to them as a child, it's amazing that stuff can resolve really quite quickly.
So even if we've got, I'd like to stay on the, especially the child sex abuse trauma, just for another minute or so, because, however long you want, actually, because we met recently in March at a conference, and one of the speakers was talking about the link or the development of complex PTSD, and the such high level, if you've experienced trauma as a child and then developing complex PTSD as an adult, of opposed to developing complex PTSD through trauma experienced as an adult.
Yeah.
And obviously that can take layers as well. That can take, if you've experienced trauma as a child, that the brain's not fully developed, you might not understand it, and this stuff might come back to you later on in life, and it might have laid dormant for a while, but these layers of poor mental health have developed over that. So dealing with the nightmares through this technique can help reduce the negative effects of that.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I will always, in my first session or two with a new client who's got these kind of issues and nightmares, is deal with it. And it doesn't matter if they've got a diagnosis of complex PTSD. It doesn't even matter if they can't really remember the trauma of what happened. And very often, sometimes that's the first indication people have, is that they've been having these nightmares of stuff. And it's really important not to interpret or take memories at face value, and even to take nightmares at face value. We're just interested in resolving the symptoms. And it's a little bit like, the kind of the pond of trauma, if you like, in people's lives. And what happens with that is that the whole dream process is kind of it's sluggish and it's not very effective. And when we start fixing the dreams, allowing them to complete, allowing that, it's their own natural trauma processing engine. It's like putting a kind of a pond filter into your pond and starting to scoot stuff up. So it doesn't matter what the diagnosis is. It doesn't matter how many times an abusive situation happened. We're just dealing with whatever's coming up in the most recent dream. And that's sometimes not even the worst part. We're retraining the brain, if you like, that it's okay to sleep through all of this stuff, and that the really interesting thing is that then we go on to treat whatever residue of the trauma is left, because of course this isn't going to fix everything. This is not a treatment for PTSD. This is a brief stabilization intervention that can take the top off PTSD and make it more livable with, to get you into treatment and everything else. But when we then do the trauma treatment, the processing of that trauma seems to resolve much quicker, which is another great thing. So it's almost like we've given the washing machine a service, if you like, and then it's doing much better on its own. So after all, this is like kind of getting free therapy, free EMDR, because there is a similarity with this form of therapy called EMDR. It's free EMDR in your sleep. And with sexual abuse, people, one really important area with this is that people often harbor some kind of revenge fantasy that it's kind of got stored away. And a lot of the time when we're creating this new dream idea, it's perfectly okay for it to be violent. And people think, no, I couldn't do something violent because it's going to make the dream gory or whatever. And what's really, really interesting from one person I've spoken to, their intervention was what do I want to happen next? Was I'm going to stab the perpetrator that's lying on top of me. Sounds brutal, sounds like it might turn into Reservoir Dogs kind of thing. But what was interesting is they remembered what had happened, and not everyone will remember what happens in their dream, but they said it was like stabbing cardboard, which is fascinating. So the brain knows it's not going to make it worse. It's almost like, when we watch Tom and Jerry, we don't think that's horribly violent, and we shouldn't let our children watch it, but it is actually incredibly violent. And so the brain knows how to deal with this stuff. And when the person who's been sexually abused, when they're then sleeping through and they're not being disturbed by this, it doesn't make them a more violent person. And you don't even have to tell the therapist what's going on in the dream. I've done this lots of times. And you don't even have to tell the therapist what it is you're going to do to the perpetrator. But actually it does work. And there are some provisos. And when I train therapists in this, we cover some of those provisos. Obviously, if you're dealing in a forensic situation with someone that's very violent, you wouldn't be encouraging them to do violent things in their dreams. But for the main part, people who've experienced sexual abuse have been violated, and they feel the sense of powerlessness is really strong there. So giving them the power back, giving them mastery and control within their dream, which is going on in their head, is often the best solution.
So the dream completion technique, let's break it down again. So education and just letting people or giving people permission, almost, that's what it sounded like. What was the next stage of this?
So the next stage is then at the point where you're being woken up in your most recent dream, whatever's going on at that point, what do you want to happen next that would feel good, that's completely unconstrained? So it's not what you'd want to happen in real life. And so when you're and the most delicate situations are obviously when someone has lost a loved one, and so you've got to be careful not to be flippant. Some of the solutions that will work for some people, like if you're in a car that's driving down the brakes have failed and you're going to hit a wall and you're with your family and it's all going badly wrong. I might encourage people to think about riding the Dodgems and it's all good fun. When you've lost someone in a very difficult circumstances, probably the most appropriate thing is, asking them, how would you like to remember this person? And then putting that into your dream. So that's really the key part. And if it doesn't work, you just haven't got the right idea. So the goal is peaceful sleep. So we keep going until it's sorted out, which might take a couple of goes, or it might happen overnight. And so that it's a simple technique, but I always say it's simple and not necessarily easy. And I've developed the resources now, a 5-minute animation that basically teaches all of this. And I found that was really the best way of doing it. And so that's been downloaded 30,000 times now, which is since December, which is exciting. And I've also trained in the last couple of months 1,000 therapists just through a 2-hour webinar how to use this with clients. We translated it into other languages. And I've just done an extended version, which you see the animation, then it's got 5 minutes of additional coaching and additional examples. Some of the stuff I'm talking about here, to be honest, to help people so that it's accessible as a self-help technique, and you can find it on YouTube, just by sticking my name in, Justin Havens, or the Dream Completion Technique. But that's enough of the pitch there, Michael. I'm sure you've got other things you want to ask me.
No, it's great. It's fantastic. And I think that where I was going to take you was how can people use this? Because it does sound so simple, yet you've seen amazing results. And, my good friend Nathan Jones, who's been on this podcast, has been going through just the very infancies with you and talking through this. And he's seeing amazing results. And he's so, well, impressed is one word, but almost relieved, I think, is another, of how it's going with him. What would someone do then? Let's say they've been having a recurring nightmare, and then tonight they want to do something they don't want to get pissed again, or they don't want to go for a 30-mile run again. They want peaceful sleep. What can they do?
Well, the first thing I'd recommend is obviously look at the YouTube video and see, and just see what you think of it. It's all about changing your perception of what you're experiencing. Now, of course, I'm not pretending that you can just watch a YouTube video and everything's going to be fine. For some people, it will be enough for them to think, yeah, okay, I get the idea. Yeah, these are my dreams. I'm in control. Hang on, I don't have to put up with this shit anymore. Excuse my language. And you can take action. And then and I encourage people to think about it, not just before they're going to sleep, but, when they're walking the dog or whatever they're doing in the day, and they've kind of got that a little bit of a window of opportunity, and they're looking for something that feels good, that will work for them. And that doesn't mean it's going to be the same for everyone. And it's not necessarily going to be the first idea you think of, but you're starting that process of taking back control. Haven't we heard that somewhere else before? I think we have, haven't we? But that's what it's all about. And if they're still struggling with it, look at some of the resources. I'm for military folk, I'm always happy to. I put it on my website. I'll do a free 20-minute chat, to help whoever it is. It is possible, even though the problem is it feels like it's impossible. It feels like you can't do it. And that's the symptoms of the trauma and the PTSD talking, which is you've got to avoid it. It's too painful. I don't want to go near it. But it does, as we know, it does work. And it doesn't have to, it's not going to be a white knuckle ride, and it's not going to be, a reliving experience. We're just looking for a way to trigger the brain's natural healing processes. I just wish people good luck, and also stay with it. If you get some improvement, stay with it, because you can get all the way. But it's really, I get excited when people tell me stories of how they've sorted out their sleep, because there's no real reason why people should stay suffering with this stuff. That's why I'm passionate about it, I guess.
What's your website called?
So my website is justinhavens.com, and you'll see some stuff there with the links on it. Hopefully we'll put the link to the video in your, with your podcast. But you can go to the website, or you can go to just YouTube and stick in Justin Havens, and then you're looking for the Dream Completion Technique, and you'll find it there. Just give it a go. Have an open mind, and good luck is all I can say. It is possible, and persevere.
Yeah, it's simple, not necessarily easy. Justin, thank you so much, and we will leave it there.